Edward Shin was ambitious. His immigrant father had built a heating and cooling business empire from nothing, and Ed wanted to follow in his father's footsteps. He was an only child and grew up in a mansion in the affluent Orange County in Southern California. His parents were deeply religious, and the whole family was heavily involved in their local church community. Ed excelled academically and in sports. He was one of those guys who seemed to be good at anything they put their mind to. And what Ed wanted more than anything was to be rich and successful. Ed landed a job in investment banking after graduating from UC San Diego in 1999. His career was going well until 2003, when Ed's father James received an email from someone who called themselves Curtis Ransom. The email was in fact a ransom letter. Ed had been kidnapped and was being held on a ransom of $1 million. Ed's parents immediately called the police. For 2 days, police searched for him and the kidnapper. His parents were worried sick, fearing their son could be killed. The matter was escalated to the FBI, who traced the IP address that sent the ransom email back to the Shin mansion. Ed had been the one who wrote the email and was attempting to extort his own father for $1 million. Ed was never investigated and no criminal case was ever opened. In 2006, Ed went on a holiday to Las Vegas with his wife Karen and their 2 young children. Through work acquaintances, Ed met Joe and Sue Koffenberg, the owners of the long-running sports memorabilia magazine, Legends. Joe was severely sick with cancer and the magazine was becoming too much work for Sue. Ed, who was a big sports fan, offered to buy the magazine for $1 million. The Koffenbergs spent some time with Ed and his family and decided he was a good fit, and they signed off on the deal. Ed took over as publisher, but he never ended up paying the $1 million. The Koffenbergs filed a lawsuit against Ed, but shortly after, an employee of Legends magazine secretly went to Sue to warn her that Ed had hired people to watch their house and was planning to possibly harm them. Sue dropped the lawsuit. In 2008, Ed met tech entrepreneur Joseph Gray at church and they quickly became friends. By now, Ed and his wife had 3 kids with another on the way. Their families hung out often, and Ed and Joe even started a men's Bible study group together. Ed confided in Joe that he, like many Americans at the time, was struggling financially. Joe lent Ed money whenever he needed it, and even asked Ed to work for him at his newest business venture, Lead Generation Technologies, or LG Tech. Ed had impressive ambition and prior experience in finance, so Joe effectively made Ed president of LG Tech. The business would create and air TV ads that targeted people who had debts, credit card, mortgage, student loans, etc. The ad would urge the viewer to call a 1-800 phone number. Then LG Tech would collect the caller's data and sell it to the highest bidder. It was a booming industry thanks to the financial crisis. Personal data is even more at risk these days, with nearly every website and app we use collecting our information. Data brokers make a fortune selling your email, phone number, and home address to annoying robocallers and spammers. So tools like Aura, the sponsor of today's video, can help protect you. Aura identifies data brokers and submits opt-out requests on your behalf. Data brokers make it very difficult for you to get your information removed, but Aura will do the hard work for you. Aura is easier to set up and does so much more than just protect you from hidden threats. It also includes safety measures like parental controls, antivirus protection, VPN, password management, identity theft insurance, and more. And you can get it all for one affordable price. If you're done with letting people exploit and profit off your private information, get Aura at aura.com/amglimpse for your free 2-week trial, or click the link in the description. A few months into his new job, Ed Shin met Christopher Smith, another ambitious guy starting out in the lead generation industry. Chris loves surfing and being out in the ocean more than anything. His friends and family called him a free spirit. He was always seeking adventure and never wanted to follow the crowd. He grew up on a farm in California where he and his brother enjoyed wakeboarding and jet skiing on a private lake on their property. Chris was very close with his family and, like Ed, was very religious. Chris and Ed didn't have much else in common other than their strong Christian faith as well as drive to make lots of money. Chris was hired to work at LG Tech, and he and Ed became something of a dynamic duo. They pretty much became the faces of the business. Two young, good-looking professionals who were exceedingly talented at finding buyers who would pay big bucks for their leads. They became so good at their jobs that they realized that they didn't need Joseph Gray anymore. In March 2009, Ed Shin secretly started his own rival company, the 800 Exchange, while still working for LG Tech. He partnered up with Chris, giving him just under 50% stake in the company. To give himself a head start on his new venture, Ed stole clients and leads from LG Tech. Ed conducted a lot of business in Las Vegas. He would troll the conventions for potential clients and impress them with Rolls-Royce Phantoms, giant suites at the Wynn Hotel, and hordes of beautiful, hired women. Ed spared no expense on these Vegas trips. There were even times he flew out on a private jet. He also enjoyed gambling, a lot. This clean-cut, church-going family man was also a degenerate gambler, gambling away tens of thousands of dollars a night. And where did he get all this cash to spend in Vegas? Ed had been skimming his LG Tech sales and depositing the money into his personal bank account. In other words, he was stealing the money. Ed and Chris both officially quit LG Tech before Joseph Gray realized what was going on. Their new venture, the 800 Exchange, was thriving. They were generating 1,500 phone calls per day and making $1 million a month. They hired a few more employees, moved into a larger office, and basked in their success. Ed and Chris made a great team. Ed was ever the professional, while Chris was more casual and brought a fun energy to the office. Chris, still the free spirit surfer at heart, would sometimes surf during the day, then work all night. He didn't trust the government and had a tendency to believe conspiracy theories. He began investing in South African gold coins called Krugerrands, which were worth about $1,000 each at the time. His goal was to get rich, then live on a remote beach where he could surf all day, then work as a bartender by night. With his newfound wealth, Chris would take his brother Paul on surfing trips around the world, and eventually he asked Paul to come work with him at the 800 Exchange. Paul and his wife and 2 kids moved to Orange County, where they became friends with Ed and his family. Ed was still organizing company trips to Vegas, where he'd always pull out all the stops to make them lavish experiences. He hired luxury cars, booked the fanciest suites, and of course, there was the arm candy. Ed's gambling got worse on these trips. There were nights he'd sit at a table for 10 hours, gambling away massive amounts of money. Word about the reckless gambling eventually got back to Joseph Gray, Ed's Bible study buddy and former boss at LG Tech. Joe had been a great friend to Ed over the last year, lending him money and giving him a senior position at his company. He got suspicious about where Ed was getting his gambling money from, so he ordered an audit of LG Tech's financials. Joe's heart sank when he saw the report. The paper trail was clear as day. Ed had embezzled over $2 million from LG Tech and had also poached countless clients. Joe felt betrayed and taken advantage of. He sued Ed in civil court. Ed was ordered to pay Joe back $700,000, but he still had a mountain of gambling debt. Ed had previously sent the Wynn Casino cashier's checks that totaled $220,000. So he took copies of those checks, then edited them to change the payee to LG Technologies. He presented the fraudulent checks to the judge, trying to pass them off as payments to Joseph Gray, but they were rejected. Despite committing fraud and perjury, Ed faced 0 legal consequences from Riverside County. Joe had to go to the county district attorney to finally have a felony embezzlement charge pressed against Ed. In May 2010, Ed was convicted but was only sentenced to probation. He was ordered to pay restitution of $700,000 or he'd go to prison. Chris didn't trust his partner anymore. Ed was now a convicted felon with a huge gambling problem, and Chris was paranoid that Ed would steal from the 800 Exchange to pay his restitution and gambling debts. Ed was the majority partner of the 800 Exchange, and Chris did not have access to their bank accounts. Chris wanted to negotiate a deal with Ed. If Chris could gain access to the company's bank accounts, then Ed could use their money to pay his restitution. Chris hired lawyer Ernesto Aldovar to help with the negotiation as well as for his own protection. On Friday, 4th of June 2010, Chris emailed Ernesto in the early afternoon to let him know that he was meeting with Ed that day. It seemed like they were still a long way off coming to an agreement. But then, at 6:01 p.m., Ernesto received an email update from Chris. I agreed in principle for Ed to buy me out. $700K of the reserve will be paid in 3 installments. When Ed sends details, I will forward and we can discuss. Ernesto then received an attachment outlining an agreement for the quote, good faith payment of $30,000 and 10 gold coins. It was a complete 180 from what Chris and Ernesto had been discussing over the last few months. Chris was suddenly being bought out of the company he had built, and where his brother still worked. On Monday, 7th of June 2010, Ernesto received another email update from Chris. The documents for the buyout were still being prepared, but Chris was leaving for a 3-week trip to South America. That same day, 800 Exchange employees received a message informing them that the office was being cleaned, so they were to stay home for the entire week. Paul Smith was irritated with his brother. Chris was supposed to pick him up from the airport that weekend, but he never showed up and wasn't answering his phone. Paul went into the office to look for Chris. As soon as he opened the door, he was hit with an overwhelming stench of fresh paint, bleach, and cleaning products. The carpet was soaking wet. Ed Shin was inside cleaning. Paul asked him what the hell had happened over the weekend. Ed explained that Chris had gone on a bender and vomited and urinated in the office. Paul noticed a large dark stain inside Chris's office. Ed said that Chris spilled red wine. When Paul asked where his brother was, Ed revealed that Chris had snapped, quit 800 Exchange, accepted a buyout deal, hired a yacht, and took off for an epic South American sailing adventure. Paul was gutted. Why didn't his brother tell him this major news? He wasn't too surprised though. Chris had always expressed disdain for the corporate slog, and he had been feeling especially fed up recently following Ed's legal dramas. Paul was more upset over the fact that he would now have to work at the 800 Exchange without his brother by his side. Chris broke the news to his family via an email. He had thrown his phone out and was going to live off the grid for a new life of freedom and adventure. He was planning to sail and surf around South America and visit the Galapagos Islands. He had broken up with his girlfriend over a text message, and his new traveling companion was Playboy model Tiffany Taylor. His family was surprised at the suddenness of it all, but this kind of thing wasn't too out of character for Chris. Over the next few weeks, Chris sent email updates to his family, gushing about his amazing new unplugged life at sea. But weeks then turned into months, as Chris added more destinations to his trip in Africa, Europe, then India. He had ditched his girlfriend, his emails became less frequent, and also began to reveal volatile mood swings. One email would happily recount some amazing experience, but then the next would be a rant blaming his parents for his childhood trauma. Things weren't adding up for Paul. He and his brother had a great childhood and were close with their parents. He also thought it was odd that Chris wasn't visiting surfing destinations. By August, Chris's father Steve, who was an ex-police officer, was getting suspicious. He wanted to test and see if it was really his son writing the emails. So he asked very specific personal questions, like, what lake did you live on as a child? Or, what type of boat did we have? But Chris had the right answers. In October, Paul was in Vegas on a business trip with Ed. It was the usual: cars, gambling, drinks, women. But on this occasion, Paul recognized one of the women who had been hired to hang out with them. She looked so familiar. Then it clicked. It was Playboy model Tiffany Taylor, Chris's sailing companion. Paul was thrilled to see her. "How's Chris?" he asked. "How was the Galapagos Islands?" Tiffany had no idea what he was talking about. She had not gone on a sailing trip and did not know Chris Smith. Soon after this trip, Paul quit the 800 exchange. In December, Chris emailed his family and told them he was now in South Africa, but he found a gold dealer in Rwanda who would pay a huge markup for his Krugerrands. His emails as of late had taken on a much darker tone. He said he was feeling scared and stressed, and that this had been the worst year of his life. He said he had been feeling suicidal and once again blamed his parents. He told Paul that he had a new business idea and wanted to meet up in February in Costa Rica to discuss it. But February came and Paul didn't hear from Chris. Paul contacted the hotel that they were planning to meet at, but they had no record of a booking under Chris Smith. The family began to grow extremely concerned that Chris fell in with dangerous people who wanted to steal his gold coins. Steve Smith contacted the Overseas Missing Persons Department and was told that Chris's passport had not been used to leave the country at all. The Smith family were beside themselves at this revelation. For months, they had been maintaining hope that Chris was okay and tried to stop their minds from wandering to the worst possibility. Steve was certain that Ed Shin knew something about what was really going on, so he'd packed a digital recorder and gun and made the long drive from Oregon to Orange County to confront Ed. Steve spoke to Ed for about an hour and secretly recorded their conversation. Ed said that because Chris didn't trust the government, he obtained a fake passport in Vegas so he could travel without being tracked. Steve played along, but wasn't buying a word Ed was saying. In April 2011, Steve officially reported Chris missing to Laguna Beach PD. In June, a full year since Chris first disappeared, Ed Shin was brought in for questioning. He told the detectives the full story about how he and Chris got into business together and how Chris would sometimes go on benders in the office. He told them about the buyout and how he had been wiring Chris installments to different countries. Ed even offered to show detectives his bank records, but the detectives never followed up. They didn't seem to seriously consider him as a suspect. Meanwhile, Laguna Beach PD weren't the only ones looking into Chris Smith's disappearance. Joe DeLue was a former police officer who was now working as a private investigator. The property manager of his office building reached out one day and asked him to look into a tenant who had vacated a neighboring office without paying $40,000 in rent. The tenant was Ed Shin. The 800 exchange had recently gone belly up, and its founder was running from many vendors demanding payments. When Joe DeLue discovered that his target was being investigated by former colleagues at Laguna Beach PD in a missing persons case, he realized that something very sinister was going on. He reached out to Steve Smith, who by now was frustrated with the lack of answers from the police. So the two ex-cops decided to conduct their own investigation together. Joe examined every single email Chris had supposedly sent. When he came across Steve's email querying about the lake and boat from his childhood, he saw that Chris had actually gone and emailed his brother Paul separately to fish for the answers to the questions. A computer forensic analyst was hired and determined that all of Chris's emails had been sent out of California. Joe was allowed into the former office of the 800 exchange, which had been sitting vacant for about a year now. He scanned every inch of the place and found what he believed was a small blood spatter on a doorframe. He had what he needed and contacted the Orange County Sheriff's Department, suspecting that a murder may have taken place in the office. A forensic team sprayed the office with luminol, a substance that would expose any traces of blood when the lights were switched off. And lo and behold, glowing spatters showed up all over the walls and ceiling. The carpets were ripped up to reveal large blood stains on the floor. The blood was tested against DNA samples taken from Chris's parents, and it was a match. Analysis of the blood splatter pattern on the walls and ceiling suggested that the victim was struck forcefully several times from above. In August 2011, Ed Shin was pulled off a plane at Los Angeles International Airport. He was trying to leave the country and go to Canada, which was a violation of his probation. He was arrested and taken to Orange County Sheriff's Office. Thinking he was in trouble for violating his probation, during questioning, Ed eventually brought up Chris Smith. The detectives played dumb and let Ed recount the story of how Chris went on a bender in the office before accepting the buyout deal and sailing off to South America. He explained how he had to close the office to clean up Chris's vomit and urine and red wine spills, unaware of the mountain of evidence that had been collected against him. An hour into the interview, the detectives dropped the act and told Ed that they knew it was Chris's blood that he was actually cleaning up. Ed said he had nothing to do with it and asked for a lawyer, ending the interview. 30 minutes later, Ed said he'd talk. He confessed that there had been a violent fight on the night of June 4th, 2010. Chris did die in the office, but Ed didn't kill him.
We were throwing blows, and that's when I jumped up, and he jumped up on the desk, and we kind of almost like two rams collided on his desk. And, it's probably where the blood got on the ceiling because, somehow I was throwing him up and he probably smeared.
Did you catch that? Ed let out a laugh as he recounted the story of how his friend and business partner supposedly died. He detailed how their fight escalated and how they began lunging at each other, and in the chaos, Chris hit his head, hard, on the edge of the desk. Ed then said he paid a Russian man to dispose of Chris's body while he got to work cleaning up. He claimed he had no idea where Chris's body was. Ed's phone records were analyzed. On June 7th and 9th, 2010, cell phone tower pings placed Ed in a remote desert town called Boulevard, which was hundreds of miles away, close to the Mexico border. The area was searched thoroughly, but Chris's body or murder weapon were never found, meaning the cause of death could not be certain, and Ed's story about the fight could not be definitively disproved. In November 2018, Ed Shin's trial finally began. It had been 7 agonizing years since he was first arrested. Despite a lack of body or murder weapon, Ed was charged with first-degree murder. The key piece of evidence to prove the murder was premeditated was the email sent to Ernesto Aldovar at 6:01 p.m. on the 4th of June 2010, the night of Chris's death. The prosecution argued that the buyout email and attached agreement detailing the good faith payment were perfectly written and showed no signs of panic, meaning it had been written before Ed met up with Chris. A handwriting analysis of the agreement found, quote, indications that the questioned signature was not produced by the same writer. Ed had prepared the email and forged agreement ahead of time as he was planning to murder Chris. He then took Chris's share of the company and his gold to pay the restitution and avoid going to prison. Ed took to the witness stand and explained that Chris had also been embezzling money from LG Technologies back in 2009, and when Ed threatened to turn him in, Chris snapped and attacked him. Ed once again recounted the violent fight he had with Chris. When he was asked why he didn't have any cuts or bruises, Ed didn't have an answer. When asked why he didn't call 911 after Chris hit his head, Ed simply replied he was in shock. When asked what he was doing near the Mexico border on 2 separate occasions, he said he was planning to leave the country for a fresh start, but changed his mind and turned back as he couldn't bear to leave his wife and 4 kids. When asked about the many emails he sent to the Smith family posing as Chris, he admitted he wrote them all and intended to lead the family into believing Chris took his own life. It took the jury less than an hour to reach a verdict. Ed Shin was found guilty of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Even though he would be spending the rest of his life behind bars, Ed reiterated in subsequent TV interviews that he didn't know where Chris's body was hidden and refused to give details about the supposed Russian man who disposed of the body. Ed also never once mentioned his family, and it is unclear if he still has a relationship with them.